Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on keeping up with EPUB standards, preserving access for backlist content. I'm Brian O'Leary, Executive Director of the Book Industry Study Group. As you may have seen when we've been promoting this particular session, we're about 10 years after the introduction of EPUB 3, but we're still seeing publishers with sometimes deep backlists of EPUB 2 books. Remediation of older titles can be a complicated issue for all publishers, but especially those who might have less staff and resources. But at the same time, upgrading EPUB files to more recent standards is essential to keeping your ebooks on sale. Newer versions of EPUB have accessibility features that older standards lack. They support real page numbers and richer navigation, and there are other improvements. So the question that came up in our workflow committee led by Krista Colson from the University of Chicago Press were, how can publishers make decisions on what books to upgrade and on what timeline, and are there methods to make some of the conversion work easier? Fortunately, Liisa McCloy-Kelley, who's Senior Vice President of Digital Product Development and Operations at Penguin Random House, has just the ticket for answering at least some of those questions. And she's going to give us an overview today of the approach that she's put in place and some recommendations, particularly with her hat on as co-chair of the publishing working group at the W3C. Liisa, welcome, and thank you for making time for us today.
So just one correction, Brian, I'm co-chair of the publishing business group.
Correct.
I want to take away the credit from my colleagues who are co-chairs of the working group.
Of course.
Hi, everyone. I run the digital product development group at Penguin Random House, and my team is made up of just over 40 people who are responsible for all of our ebook production for our core publishers and for the production and distribution of ebooks, audiobooks, POD, and look inside files for our client publishers and for our digital workflow support team who help us with our tagging at PRH and our design and production processes, and building all of the tools that we use for doing all of those things. So we're responsible for about exactly 93,261 active ebooks right now. And of that list, there are 82,000 of them that are reflow EPUB, and quite a lot of that even in our case is still EPUB 2. So I want to start today just by saying that a reminder that ebooks are software. And if you started your work in this industry like I did back in 1998 when we started to make ebooks at PRH, it's been 25 years. The software that we use for those early books, things have come a long way, and a lot of things have changed, and a lot of things from those early days have not necessarily changed, particularly if you started working on this back when things started to take off between 2007, 2009. The files that we made back then, they're teenagers now, they're high schoolers, they're really getting a bit dated, and software needs to be continually updated, and we need to keep working on it to meet customer expectations because those things have evolved in the last 20 years. And so you should really, as you're thinking about your ebook programs, plan to update your entire catalog at least once every 10 years. Don't think that you're going to make these books and never look back at them. If you're not planning to update and refresh the whole thing, start thinking about how do you do it in cycles, and how do you manage to at least do some amount of updating on a regular basis along the way. If you're still making EPUB 2 right now, it's really beyond time to change your processes. The format itself has been deprecated since 2014, but like I said, if you still have a lot of EPUB 2 in your catalog, you're not alone. But it is time to start thinking about the next generation of ebooks and how you're going to get there. So when I look back at the things that we were doing in the early days of ebooks, and particularly with EPUB 2, it wasn't just a limitation of what the standard could support, but also a limit of what the market could support. And, EPUB 2 at the time had very simple HTML, but there were also a lot of requirements from the marketplace to keep images low res, to keep down file size. There were a lot of places where publishers captured text as image because the character support was not widely available across the marketplace. A lot of files initially done were done from digital files that were images of plates and were badly OCR'd, or were scans of physical books and were badly OCR'd. There was a lot of things that we did with capturing tables as images because the coding for tables was not there and not supported yet. And there wasn't good support for alignment. There weren't good support for lists. Finding that common denominator of what you could build at the time that would actually work across the marketplace, as we were all trying to get to one format that we could send to everyone. We all made mistakes along the way. And everybody everywhere was trying to do things very cheap, very fast. And some of us, moved on to doing other things and not wanting to look back at it. But where things are now, we are at a point that EPUB 3 has been out, as Brian said, for a long time. It was released in October of 2011. And EPUB 3.3, which has been updated over the course of the last couple of years by the publishing working group at the W3C, is going to be released in late May. So it is upon us to start looking at this new format, though there are not a lot of differences between EPUB 3.2 and EPUB 3.3. The overall change of the spec was to normalize the writing, to make sure things were super consistent, to make sure that it could be implemented and tested in ways that were not possible before. So there shouldn't be a lot of concern that if you are doing your work with EPUB 3.2 now, that 3.3 is not going to be a big shift. There are some differences with the validation. So EPUB Check 5.0, which is the validation for 3.3, is out now. You can use it now. I would recommend that you plan for the next several months to be validating with both EPUB Check 4.2.6 and EPUB Check 5.0, and know that there are some differences in those validations because some things have been changed in terms of warnings have become infos in some places, and some retailers have started to require EPUB Check 5.0 and that it pass all of those validations. So it's kind of good to get ahead of it. Accessibility is a really big thing that's everybody is dealing with now. And right now is a really good time as you're thinking about accessibility to also be thinking about your backlist, because going in and doing something once to get it done for the next 5 years is going to be so much better than going in to make changes to get from one format to another, but then not necessarily to get to what you need to truly make your ebooks accessible. The promise of digital was always that it would make content more accessible for people with a variety of reading disabilities. And that didn't truly come to fruition because it takes a lot of extra work, both in your print processes and after, to ensure that everything that needs to be there to make an ebook accessible is in the code. Accessibility includes design and layout practices that are going to allow for users to enlarge text and images, to have good contrast, to have all the code that's needed to help a screen reader to actually be able to interpret the content. and read it to a user and allow them to navigate through it. Both publishers and reading systems are really only now getting to the point where they're seriously addressing this. And we're still in a bit of a chicken and egg as problems are resolved, as people are trying to implement it. And certainly not quite yet to the point where every reading system is fully accessible, every book is fully accessible, and that buyers who need accessible content can see that metadata on detail pages to know that what they're getting is what they need. But many people are realizing that there is a large market of people who would purchase content if it was more usable for them. And with all of the changes that are happening in the European Accessibility Act, legal requirements are becoming more standard both across Europe and around the world that are really pushing people to address the accessibility needs in their ebooks. So my biggest recommendation for accessibility is make reflow EPUB wherever you can. Like if you don't have to make fixed layout for something, you don't have to have images to the bleed on every page. It is much easier to make your reflow book accessible than it is to work on accessibility for fixed layout. And building good practices around ebook design that does not necessarily match print is also helpful for getting to a good level of accessibility. So what do I mean by that? Like sometimes you need to change the colors in order to make sure that the contrast ratio works. Sometimes you're going to want to change the fonts to make them more readable. Sometimes you're going to want to change the weight on rules and boxes and other things to make sure that your digital content is very accessible in a way that your print never could have, or your print is not necessarily focused on. Not to say that it couldn't be more accessible in print. Including good navigation, good title level information for the HTML pages, making sure that you maintain page maps and link page references throughout, using proper HTML for heads, for lists, for tables, for asides, embedding fonts really where they're important and where they've been tested to make sure that they are accessible, to make sure that they're very usable across the device landscape. Using high-res images as much as you can, making sure that you've got alt text or long descriptions to describe what's happening in those images, making sure that you use good use of figures and to keep the captions with your images, taking care with your space break ornaments to make sure that they have a proper role of presentation, taking care with your URLs, your hyperlinks, the spacing on things, and as I said before, a good use of color and contrast on your text and with any kind of boxes that you have. And really good footnote practices are important for accessibilities. So as you're thinking about this future of accessibility and you're thinking about what do I do with all these backlist files, it's a really good thing to start by evaluating your backlist. Look at what titles you have. When did you make those files? Do you have any data about how you made those files? Think about how you put things into buckets and even into eras of, this was the time frame where we were scanning a lot of material. These are the files where we know that, they were before that time when Amazon finally told us they could take high-res images. Try to think about how you break this work down into chunks. So you may want to use data from partners. You may want to do some evaluation of your files. You may want to look back through your databases or your notes. You may want to run some validations like using EPUB check or ACE checker to try to figure out where are all of the segments of the project you have in front of you. And you may even want to think about buying some of your books and maybe other books from other publishers to look at how they work in market, because sometimes you go back and you look at really old titles. I was looking this morning at a book that we published in 2008, and considering that we haven't touched that file since 2010, I can see that the styles are a little bit different. The resolution on something was off a bit, but for the most part, the file wasn't in terrible shape. And looking at, what would we need to do to get that to a cleaner space? It's a lot less work for a file where you're not really looking at a massive amount of reformatting or reconversion. So, makes it a little bit easier for you to think about, what do you want to do? What is that experience you want to have? And if you make multiple EPUB formats, you might want to figure out where you focus first. And again, I think as you think about your backlist, really trying to focus on the reflow is important, because particularly if you're thinking about the European Accessibility Act, there is a carve out in that act for things that are highly designed. So you will not be at as much risk for a cookbook that you may have, done as a fixed layout title, or for a children's picture book as you would be for a very popular fiction book. And then sit down and develop a plan for what you need now and how you set yourself up for 3 years, 5 years, some period of time that gets you through, and think about, what do you ultimately want? Is it better formatting? Is it richer navigation? Is it bolting in some accessibility? Are you going to do something like set a target for WCAG AA? Are you going to start with EPUB 3.2, or are you going to start with EPUB 3.3? You don't have to wait. You can find a way, this is Mia, to incorporate real page numbers where you can, because more reading systems are actually supporting that in the files. If you can find a way to bring in high-res images so that you can provide a better reading experience, it helps everyone. For some titles you come across, it's actually going to mean that you need to reconvert them. For other titles, it may be that you could find automation to do the updating. It may be that while you're thinking about doing this work to add in, to get to EPUB 3, to get accessibility, there may be other things that you could be doing in the work. You may want to add in a back ad. You may want to look at putting in marketing material. You may want to put in reading group guides. You may want, there are lots of opportunities of how you can take advantage of being in there and doing this work. And really important to try to build some processes and code that are consistent so that you reduce your testing time, so that what you're doing is reliable going forward. And also time to think about whether styles have maybe changed and whether there might be something to let go of. I know we went through a weird period of making URLs linked green, and certainly that seems dated at this point. Some publishers still link every chapter title back to the inline TOC, which to me feels like a dated moment of that was really useful when we were using the inline TOC more than the navigation, but so much of the navigation now is built into the reading system that doesn't seem to be as necessary a feature. And then you work on prioritizing the work that you have in front of you. You start thinking about how you break things into segments how maybe you focus on your top selling books and series, how you look at a combination of net sales and rate of movement to isolate not only your top sellers, but what's selling now, what's high profile. Maybe you want to work on the simpler stuff first in order to build up your skills and confidence and to knock some of the work out. Maybe you want to narrow the work by focusing on getting your front list process really tight before you dig into a backlist project. Maybe you're thinking about the risks legally with the EAA and you want to focus on what you're selling in Europe before you focus on other things. And just a really good practice is to try to build up enough muscle, enough process to make sure that you're touching some portion of the catalog every year. We typically, without particularly meaning to, but just in the course of regular business, we touch about 10% of our catalog every year with some kind of update. And as we start working on this path of getting the catalog really up to speed, I think that we will focus on touching even more of it on an annual basis so that at any given point, there's less that needs a massive amount of rework. But the biggest thing that I can recommend to you is just get started. Break it into doable small chunks and, just start, because it can seem very insurmountable to work on a big project. And it can seem very, like, how are we going to get the money? How are we going to get the time? If you can just get started, you can start to picture how you can break something up over time, how you can approach it in a way that gets you progress. And that helps you to then start figuring out, how do you want to do the work? Do you want to do it with in-house staff? Do you want to do it with a vendor? Do you want freelancers? Do you need a big external project with an RFP? Talk to colleagues about how they're approaching these kinds of things, because there's no one right answer. There's an approach that's going to work for every publisher, but it's going to be different for every publisher, the same way that we all have different approaches to how we make our ebooks in the first place and how we publish our books and how that fits into our publishing program. The important thing is just to get started, because the more we all contribute to improving the experience of digital reading, the more we help keep the format alive, the more we help create an experience that allows readers to just sink into the stories and not to get caught up in, wow, I like print books, ebooks suck. Because they don't have to suck. You can have a really amazing immersive experience with an ebook. So with that, I want to ask, do you have any questions?
We do, and maybe I could start with a couple from Bill. Bill asks first, within PRH, where you have probably your greatest level of experience, how much of your EPUB work is done by the staff, with PRH staff, and how much of it do you use vendors outside the mix? And if it's kind of a little bit of both, what leads you to make a choice between in or out?
So we do a vast majority of our work in-house. We do use external vendors, and there are a handful of things that go into what tools and processes we use. One of them is what kind of tagging, if any, was used in the file that we have as source. So we have 2 internal workflows that are meant to match the Random House markup language and the Penguin markup language, and are really key to take advantage of the editorial tagging. If something is not tagged, we have another workflow that we use internally. If a book has if it's something that we're trying to, for whatever reason, bring back from something that doesn't have good source files, we definitely will use a vendor to double key it. If we have something that just has a massive amount of repetitive work in it, a really long index, a lot, like thousands of notes, we will use a vendor for a project like that because ultimately it will be cheaper. And for the work that we do for our client publishers, we use a vendor, and we have 5 reflow EPUB workflows. And the big thing that we do is that we have a specification for the way that we make ebooks that is consistent across all 5 of those processes. So it doesn't necessarily matter which process we used. The process is going to be consistent on the output, and the kind of code that we used is consistent.
And Bill's related question is, and I think you've answered in part in this first piece, the production of EPUBs, is it currently part of the overall typesetting and print production workflow, or is it done separately from the print production workflow?
It's done separately from print production. It is, so we're a corporate team who provides this as a service to our in-house publishers. And the reason we settled on that is that the troubleshooting of issues in market with ebooks, there are a lot of patterns that you see out there, but you're not going to see those patterns if you're one person out of hundreds across a big corporate production group, right? Or a lot of small production groups across a big corporate structure. So we centralized our production so that we can do it consistently. We can keep the expertise in a group of people who continue to build skills on it, where we can continue to build growth for that team of people, professional development and growth for that team of people, and where we can continue to feed into the process that helps with the upstream workflow to make things easier as we get it.
Great, thank you. So Lillian's asking, I think in this example, for a large book having more than 1,000 pages in a print format, is there an ebook that's recommended for Kindle? And she adds, we recently had a textbook that had many figures and tables that had to stay together, so they did it as fixed layout, but created a number of problems on that platform. Do you have any advice on that, either to make it reflowable or to make sure that it's better supported in the ecosystem?
So we find that if we use proper HTML figure coding to put an image inside of a figure with its caption, and you hang all of that together in the HTML, it actually really works well across platform to keep the captions and the images on the same page. You have to do a little bit of work with the sizing of the image to make sure that you're not going to end up with something that makes an image blow out too big to lose the caption. But a little bit of creative use of page breaks and page break inside a void and figures goes a long way.
Great, thank you. Just a question from Beth on a technical level. How do you discover what EPUB version your ebook uses? She's asking, can I assume a converter in 2020 used EPUB 3? And I think you would say, I wish, but maybe how do you know, and how can you work with your vendor to make sure they're using the most current version?
So one quick way to know if you've got an EPUB 3 is to crack the thing open and look to see, do you have a nav doc? Because if you've got a nav doc, you probably have an EPUB 3. You can also validate the file, but as Brian points out, it probably is not always a safe bet that a vendor in this day and age would always make an EPUB 3.
Morton's asking, maybe you're saying this more broadly than just PRH, but who do you see as responsible for things like alt text and long descriptions, authors, editors, or production team? And he's asking because he finds it difficult to see how our production team can describe an image with characters with known names, etc. in a children's book when you don't know the story?
Yeah, so ultimately, creators are the people who should be writing alt text. So the way that we're looking at this problem is to separate how we think about this for the future, how we think about it for the backlist. We've done a lot of work over the past couple of years with our internal team to think about, how do you write alt text? How do you know when to make a long description? How do we describe well the kinds of images that are in books and all of the kinds of images that are in books? But we are now taking all of that learning to go back through and start writing guidelines for editors and authors to try to figure out where this fits into our upstream workflow. And a lot of it depends on how the images come into the book and what kind of a book it is. But we do think that ultimately editors and authors should be the ones who write the image descriptions to give the best image description possible. More
Great.
than likely
Thank
for the backlist, we'll do some amount of vendor writing of things, and we'll see where we get with that.
Chris is asking if, she works in a smaller press. So not necessarily small, but I guess everybody's smaller than PRH. If she says, if you're feeling overwhelmed, just wonders, is it your experience that going from EPUB 2 to EPUB 3 is the heavier lift, or does it kind of vary based upon the type of book and the type of content?
EPUB 2 to EPUB 3 can be a relatively minor lift. Accessibility is a harder lift than EPUB 2 to EPUB 3. The place where EPUB 2 is the biggest lift is if you have a lot of text that was captured as image, if you have a lot of low-res images, because we have not yet found a really good way to automate that piece of doing an automated update from 2 to 3.
And I don't know the name, it's just a kind of an acronym, but a question that came in is, does the EAA carve out that you mentioned include technical publications with lots of charts and graphs? Would that conceivably be considered heavily designed?
Maybe, like children's books, cookbooks, art books, photography books are very specifically named. The very technical books with figures, it's a little bit more of a stretch, though there is still a lot of conversation across Europe about whether there will be some kind of understanding, forgiveness on things that are just really hard to get done.
So probably worth investigating, don't just assume.
Yeah. And I would say just generally, like the way that the EAA will work, there will be a structure of ways to complain about a problem, but then each country is actually figuring out how to implement, how they will respond to that. And there will be fine structures, but there will also be mediation structures. So more than likely what will happen is someone encounters a book that's not accessible, they complain about it to, the Italian association that's handling this. The Italian association reaches out to the publisher, says this is not accessible, there is a complaint, and there is a moment and an opportunity to say, oh my gosh, we did not mean for that, we will absolutely fix it, and you fix it. There's going to be periods of time before fines would be implemented. In the case of Italy, that fine would end up being like $8,000. So, it could be financially important to get there, but it's not going to be the same process as what we've seen in other countries where there were lawsuits and large damages.
So they're trying to provide a pathway for feedback and remediation as opposed to penalties and fines if they can avoid it.
Exactly.
One last question here, and then we have a couple people with their hands raised that I might need to just invite in for voice. Ashley's asking, do you use tools for automating like a conversion from EPUB 2 to 3, or is that not practical for your purposes?
We actually use a tool that we built ourselves.
Okay.
And we did a lot of evaluation of our files and figuring out what were all of the steps between, getting the HTML cleaned up, getting the navigation doc inserted, getting the file structure to our new standards. And we figured out like all of those steps that we wanted in place, and we built a script to actually do that for our files. And I would imagine if you don't have the resources to build something like that, you could certainly come up with a list of what you think the differences are to have someone else figure out whether there's a process or something that they could offer.
Are you thinking of selling it?
I'm not thinking of selling it just because it's, it's softwares to support, right? Like
Right.
Making it run on our machines versus making it run on lots of other people's machines is a different thing.
And we had one person, Larry Bennett, just wanted to ask a question. Larry, can you hear us okay?
Yeah, no, I hear fine, and I apologize. I'm driving, so I couldn't write. But this is great. I just wanted to add in something about what you were talking about, accessibility and fixed layout. And I work for Nord Compo. We work with a lot of different publishers, and we do a lot of EPUB conversions as part of typesetting or independently. So that's just the background. But the comment is, we're seeing demand from across a bunch of different publishers in a bunch of different states in the United States for accessible fixed layouts for picture books, for children's books. And obviously that can't be done, as you've said, with an EPUB. So we've figured out a workaround for the customers who really need it, using a PDF. And it seems to work very well. It seems to be being accepted. But I just wanted to comment that there is a demand for that, and hopefully EPUB in the future will come through with an easier way than a PDF. That's it. Thank you.
And Larry,
Thank you,
thanks so
Larry.
much for that. There actually is work being done within the W3C to work on standards for fixed layout, accessibility, and good guidelines for how to approach that. So it is absolutely in the works.
Great, thank you, Lisa. I just wanted to add something, a note from Krista Colson, who, as I said, is chair of our workflow committee and kind of the instigator for ultimately inviting you to talk with us today. She just said that you planted a lot of ideas about the ways to combine added value in this work, and she's actually feeling oddly motivated by not having 82,000 EPUBs on her backlist to handle. So thank you very much, Lisa. It's always great to see you. And I know you've been a long time advocate and supporter for BISG, and it's great to see so much good work going on at PRH and the W3C.
And as Krista points out, the fixed layout guide that the committee just put together is available.
Yep, we're going to be promoting that next month and probably doing our next webinar from the workflow committee will be in June on that.
And if
Thanks
anybody's
again.
interested in getting involved with the W3C's publishing community group to work on that fixed layout standard, please definitely reach out to me, to Dave, to Bill. Lots of us cross these communities.
Yeah, people are probably not knowing that Dave is Dave Kramer and Bill is Bill Kasdor.
Okay, yes.
Thank you. Take care, and thank you again for making the time today.
Thanks, everyone.